What if this moment didn't arrive by accident, but also didn't need to arrive twice? Have you ever noticed how some messages don't feel new, yet they land as if they were waiting for you? Not forcing their way in, not begging for attention, just appearing quietly at the exact second something inside you was finally ready to listen. There's something unsettling about the fact that you're here right now. And no, I'm not talking about algorithms, recommendations, or timing in the usual sense. I'm talking about that subtle internal pause you felt before clicking, that brief hesitation where your body reacted before your mind had a reason, as if a part of you recognized something familiar, long before you could explain why. Imagine this. Most of your life is spent walking past doors you don't even notice, not because they're hidden, but because you weren't meant to open them yet. And then one day, without warning, you stop. You don't know what changed. You just know you couldn't keep walking. That's how real shifts begin. They don't arrive with noise. They don't announce themselves as important. They slip in disguised as a sentence, a glance, a quiet realization that rearranges something deep inside you. And once that rearrangement happens, it doesn't need to repeat itself. The door doesn't stay open, not because you're being denied entry, but because you've already crossed the threshold. Most people spend their lives searching for signs, reassurance, confirmation that they're on the right path. They want messages to repeat, lessons to come back around, clarity to knock louder next time. But the truth is far less dramatic and far more uncomfortable. Some things are only meant to reach you once, not because they're fragile, but because they work. They do what they came to do and then dissolve into you, quietly, permanently, like a drop of ink in water that never separates again. Think back, not to something you learned, but to something that changed you. A conversation that lasted minutes but altered years. A realization that didn't feel explosive, just final. As if a question you didn't know how to ask suddenly stopped needing an answer. Those moments don't beg to be revisited. They don't perform. They integrate. And here's the part most people never consider. The fear you feel when something happens only once isn't about missing out. It's about responsibility. Because if the message doesn't come back, then whatever shifts stays with you. You can't outsource it. You can't wait for a better version. You can't pretend you didn't see what you saw. That's why we cling, we replay, we revisit the same sources hoping to feel the same impact again. But when it doesn't land the same way, we think something's wrong. We think we lost the magic. What if that flatness isn't loss, but completion? What if the frustration you feel when something no longer hits the same way is actually a signal that it already moved inside you and is waiting to be lived rather than consumed? Right now, something in you is closer to the surface than it's been in a long time. Not clarity, not answers. Readiness, the kind that doesn't shout, but changes what you're willing to tolerate. The kind that doesn't ask for more information, but for alignment. You didn't stop here because you're lost. You stopped because a part of you is done searching in circles. And that part is beginning to recognize the difference between collecting insight and becoming it. There's a reason this feels quiet instead of dramatic. A reason nothing is being pushed, sold, or promised with fireworks. The most important shifts never need spectacle. They need honesty, and they need timing. And timing, real timing, has nothing to do with clocks. It has everything to do with whether you're finally able to see what's been in front of you all along. Because once you do, there's no going back to not seeing it. There's a specific kind of discomfort people rarely talk about, not because it's rare, but because it's hard to explain without sounding dramatic. It usually begins quietly. You wake up from a dream that felt heavier than usual, not symbolic in an obvious way, not prophetic, just present, as if it left a residue behind. You go through your morning, but part of you is still somewhere else, carrying a feeling you can't name. Later that day, your body reacts before your mind does. A tightness in the chest for no clear reason. A sudden wave of fatigue, even though nothing physically demanding happened. Or the opposite, a strange alertness, like your nervous system is listening for something you can't hear yet. You tell yourself it's stress, hormones, sleep, life. And maybe sometimes it is, but not always. What makes it confusing is that nothing looks wrong from the outside. You're functioning, you're showing up, you're doing what's expected. But internally, something feels slightly misaligned, like a compass that still points north, but keeps vibrating in your hand. You don't feel lost exactly, just unsettled, as if your inner world is trying to get your attention without interrupting your life too loudly. This is often when people start noticing patterns, not the obvious kind, but the subtle ones. Repeated emotional reactions that don't match the situation. A recurring sense that certain environments drain you faster than they used to. A growing sensitivity to conversations that once felt normal. Words land differently now. Silence feels louder. Crowds feel heavier. Some people experience it as physical sensations. Others as emotional shifts. Others still as a quiet but persistent intuition that something is changing, even if they can't point to what. And the most frustrating part is that there's no clear instruction manual for this phase. No checklist, no announcement that says, this is happening now. So people doubt themselves. They wonder if they're imagining it, if they're being overly sensitive, if they just need rest, distraction, or something new to focus on. And so they scroll, they consume. They search for language that might finally explain what they're feeling, not because they want drama, but because they want relief. They want to know they're not alone in this strange in-between state. Here's what rarely gets said. Not all communication is verbal, and not all guidance arrives as information. Some messages arrive as sensations, as resistance, as a growing inability to ignore what no longer fits. Your system starts rejecting things it once tolerated. And that rejection doesn't come with polite explanations. It comes with discomfort. Think about how the body reacts when something doesn't belong in it. There's nausea, inflammation, fatigue. It's not punishment, it's intelligence. The same thing happens on an inner level. When your awareness begins to shift, what once felt neutral can start to feel unbearable. Not because it's suddenly bad, but because you're no longer calibrated to it. That's where the mystery deepens. Because at this stage, people often look for signs outside themselves to confirm what's happening inside. They want something external to validate the internal shift. A dream that feels meaningful. A coincidence that feels charged. A moment where their intuition spikes without warning. And when those things happen, they don't feel random. They feel personal, targeted. As if something is trying to speak in a language that bypasses logic. But without context, these experiences feel fragmented. Is it intuition or anxiety? Insight or imagination? Growth or burnout? The mind wants certainty, labels, a clean explanation. But the deeper processes don't work that way. They communicate through sensation, repetition, and timing. Through what keeps resurfacing when you try to ignore it. Through what refuses to quiet down no matter how much you rationalize it away. This is usually when the real discomfort sets in. Not fear, but tension. The tension of standing between who you've been and who you're becoming, without clear instructions on how to cross that space. You feel like something is asking more of you, but you don't yet know what that more looks like. And the question that starts forming, often late at night when everything is quiet, isn't what should I do? It's something far more unsettling. What if this isn't coincidence, and I'm already being spoken to in a way I haven't learned how to understand yet? Here is the first truth most people are never taught, not because it's dangerous, but because it removes control from the outside world. The earliest spiritual signal is not a vision, a voice, or a supernatural event. It is something far quieter, and because of that, it's usually ignored. The first real sign is internal resistance, not fear, not confusion, resistance. There comes a moment, often subtle, when your inner system starts pushing back against a life that once felt acceptable. Nothing dramatic has happened yet, no collapse, no awakening scene. But suddenly, what used to feel fine begins to feel heavy. Conversations feel draining, routines feel hollow. Goals that once motivated you start losing their emotional charge. Ancient traditions describe this not as crisis, but as misalignment. In early contemplative teachings, this phase was called the stirring, the point where awareness outgrows the container it's been living in. The container doesn't break immediately, it just starts to feel tight. This is why so many people misinterpret the signal. They think something is wrong with them. They assume they're ungrateful, restless, or broken. They try to fix the discomfort by changing surface-level things, new habits, new environments, new distractions, but the discomfort doesn't leave, because the discomfort isn't the problem, it's the message. In older spiritual systems, growth was never announced through excitement first. It was announced through loss of tolerance. When the soul, or if you prefer the deeper self, begins to shift, it withdraws energy from what no longer reflects its next state. And when energy withdraws, what remains feels empty. That emptiness scares people, so they rush to fill it. But the emptiness isn't a void, it's a clearing. Think about how night vision works. When you first enter darkness, you see less. Your instinct is to turn on a light. But if you wait, if you allow your eyes to adjust, you begin to see more than you could before. Subtler shapes, deeper contrast, hidden movement. The same principle applies here. The first sign is not clarity. It is the collapse of false clarity. Things that once made sense no longer do. Explanations you accepted without question start feeling thin. Advice that once comforted you now feels incomplete. This isn't confusion, it's discernment beginning to activate. Ancient teachers warned that this stage is the easiest one to abort because it doesn't reward you immediately. It asks you to sit with discomfort without demanding answers. And most people don't want that. They want reassurance, not revelation. But revelation doesn't arrive where everything is already comfortable. It arrives where something quietly refuses to stay the same. This is why the sign often appears as emotional friction, as sensitivity, as an inability to go back to how you used to see things. You might not know what you're moving toward yet, but you know what you can no longer fully participate in. And here's the part that sounds almost forbidden in modern spirituality. This resistance is not meant to be healed away. It's meant to be listened to. Older wisdom didn't treat discomfort as failure. It treated it as initiation, a threshold state where the old identity hasn't collapsed yet, but the new one hasn't fully formed. That in-between space feels unstable because it is. You're no longer anchored where you were, but not yet grounded where you're going. Most people mistake that instability for danger, but in reality, it's precision. The system is recalibrating, and once this recalibration begins, it doesn't reverse. You can suppress it, distract from it, delay it, but you can't unknow it. Something in you has already recognized that a deeper alignment exists, and that recognition changes the rules. This is why so many people feel both unsettled and strangely calm at the same time. There's anxiety, yes, but also an undercurrent of truth. A sense that even though things feel uncertain, they feel honest. That honesty is the sign, and it appears before anything else does, before insight, before language, before direction. It's the internal signal that says, what comes next will require a different version of you. If this resonates, if you've felt this quiet resistance, this loss of tolerance, this sense that something unseen is rearranging your inner world, take a moment to acknowledge it. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to justify it. Just recognize it. And if this kind of understanding speaks to you, consider supporting this space by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Not as a transaction, but as a way of stepping into a community that explores these shifts with clarity, depth, and respect for the unseen processes most people never name. Because once you understand this first sign, something else becomes impossible to ignore. And that next realization doesn't arrive as resistance. It arrives as recognition. There's a memory that still feels unusually vivid whenever I think about it, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quietly it rewired me. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you forget as soon as it ends. The light outside was flat, almost colorless. I was sitting alone in a small cafe, the low hum of conversation blending with the clinking of cups. Nothing about that day suggested it would matter. I wasn't searching for answers. I wasn't expecting insight. I was simply tired in a way sleep hadn't fixed. At the table next to mine sat someone I didn't know. We exchanged a polite nod, nothing more. And then, without any build-up, they said something, not to me directly at first, almost as if thinking out loud. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for permission to become who they already are. The words landed strangely, not like advice, not like wisdom being offered, more like a mirror being placed in front of me before I had time to look away. I didn't respond right away. My body reacted first, a tightening in the chest, a warmth behind the eyes, the kind of sensation you feel when something accurate touches a place you've been protecting with distractions. When I finally looked up, they were watching me, not intensely, not expectantly, just present. We talked for maybe 20 minutes after that, about nothing profound on the surface: work, fatigue, the strange pressure people feel to perform versions of themselves that no longer fit. There were no instructions given, no solutions handed over. And yet, something irreversible happened in that exchange. I remember walking out of the cafe feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because something false had loosened its grip. Heavier because I could no longer pretend I hadn't seen it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from excitement, but from recognition. Thoughts kept circling back, not in panic, but in quiet clarity. I realized how many decisions I'd postponed, how many parts of myself I'd placed on hold, waiting for the right signal, the right timing, the right validation. And what unsettled me most was this realization: no one was coming to give me that permission. The conversation never repeated itself. I never saw that person again. I don't even remember their name. But that moment didn't fade like other memories. It integrated. It started showing up in my choices, in what I tolerated, in what I stopped explaining away. I noticed it first in small ways, saying no without over-justifying, losing interest in conversations that revolved around proving rather than being, feeling a subtle resistance whenever I tried to return to old patterns that once felt safe. And every time that resistance appeared, it carried the same quiet message: you already know. That's when I understood something important. The power of that moment wasn't in the words themselves. It was in my readiness to hear them. If that conversation had happened a year earlier, it might have bounced right off me. If it had happened later, it might have felt obvious. But in that exact timing, it slipped past my defenses and did its work. This is how real transformation often happens, not through grand awakenings, but through simple encounters that arrive when your inner world is finally aligned enough to receive them. I've heard countless variations of this story since then. Someone describes a dream they can't shake. Another mentions a sentence overheard in passing that changed how they see themselves. Someone else talks about a moment of physical exhaustion that forced them to stop pretending everything was fine. Different forms, same pattern, a single appearance, a quiet transfer, a permanent shift. And what all these stories share is this: once the message integrates, it doesn't demand repetition. The impact continues even when the source disappears. There's no unfinished business, no need for closure. The exchange completes itself. That's what makes these moments both beautiful and unsettling. They don't stay to comfort you. They trust you to carry what mattered forward on your own. If you've experienced something like this, if there's a moment in your life that didn't look important at the time, but later revealed itself as a turning point, I want you to share it. Go to the comments and describe the experience, the sign, the conversation, the dream, or the feeling that changed you in a way you couldn't undo. I read these stories, and some of them deserve to be spoken aloud, because when one person recognizes their moment in another's story, something subtle wakes up. And there's a reason these stories surface now, because once you recognize how these moments work, it becomes impossible not to notice the next one forming quietly beneath the surface. Once the first sign appears, internal resistance, most people assume the work is done. They think awareness alone is the transformation, but awareness is only the door. What comes next determines whether the shift deepens or fades back into noise. Here is the second sign, and this one is harder to notice because it doesn't announce itself as spiritual at all. The second sign is selective resonance. At a certain point, your inner world begins to respond very clearly to some things and go completely quiet around others. You're not reacting more, you're reacting less, but when you do react, it's precise. Certain words land with unexpected weight. Certain ideas feel strangely familiar, even if you're hearing them for the first time. Meanwhile, entire conversations, opinions, and even advice that once mattered barely register anymore. They don't offend you, they don't confuse you, they simply pass through without sticking. Ancient teachings describe this as the moment when discernment replaces curiosity. Before this stage, people search broadly, they collect ideas, they explore possibilities. Everything feels potentially useful, but once selective resonance activates, something changes. Your system no longer treats all information equally. It starts filtering based on alignment, not interest. This is why people in this phase often feel misunderstood. Others might say you're becoming distant, less enthusiastic, harder to impress. But internally, the opposite is happening. You're becoming more attuned, more precise, less willing to spend energy on what doesn't move anything inside you. And this isn't arrogance, it's efficiency. In older wisdom traditions, this stage was associated with maturity, not age, but energetic maturity. The understanding that not everything deserves your attention, even if it's intelligent, popular, or well-intended. Here's how you recognize this sign in daily life. You notice that when something is aligned, your body responds before your thoughts do. There's a subtle settling, a quiet yes that doesn't need justification. It might feel like relief, or stillness, or a sense of rightness that doesn't require excitement. And when something is misaligned, the response is equally clear, but not dramatic. There's no panic, no argument, just a lack of energy, a sense that continuing in that direction would require force. This is the signal most people override. They talk themselves out of it. They say things like, I should want this, or this makes sense logically, or everyone else seems fine with it. And so they push past their resonance and wonder why they feel drained afterward. The second sign isn't about chasing what excites you. It's about respecting what doesn't respond. Now here's the practical part, the technique that turns this understanding into something usable. For the next few days, don't ask yourself what you want. Instead, ask this question in quiet moments. What responds when I stop forcing? Pay attention to what feels neutral, heavy, or silent inside you, and don't judge it. Silence is information. Lack of resonance is information. Your system is communicating in a language that doesn't use words. When you're deciding whether to engage, speak, agree, or pursue something, pause briefly and notice your internal state before you think about it. Not your emotions, not your opinions, your baseline energy. Does it expand? Does it contract, or does it remain flat? You don't need to act on this immediately. The practice isn't about impulsive decisions. It's about rebuilding trust with your internal signal. Because here's what most people were never taught. Your inner guidance doesn't shout when it's strong. It becomes quieter and clearer. The more you respect it, the less dramatic it needs to be. This is why people who are deeply aligned often appear calm. They're not detached. They're not passive. They're simply no longer negotiating with signals they already understand. And once you begin honoring selective resonance, something subtle but powerful happens. Your life starts organizing itself with less effort. Certain paths fade without conflict. Others come into focus without persuasion. Not because you're manifesting, because you're finally listening accurately. If this perspective resonates, if you recognize this filtering beginning to operate in your own life, consider subscribing to the channel. Not as a habit, but as a signal. A way of staying connected to a space where these deeper processes are explored without distortion, urgency, or performance. Because there is a third sign, and unlike the first two, it doesn't show up as discomfort or resonance. It shows up as a moment of stillness so precise that most people mistake it for nothing at all. There is a final sign, one so subtle that most people miss it entirely, not because it's hidden, but because it leaves no emotional residue behind, no excitement, no fear, no urgency, just a quiet, unmistakable stillness. Ancient teachings warned that this sign would be overlooked by those who expected awakening to feel dramatic. They called it the moment of return, not a return to who you were, but to what has always been underneath the noise. This sign doesn't arrive during chaos. It doesn't appear in pain or longing. It comes after resistance has softened, after resonance has refined your attention, when there's nothing left to chase. And when it appears, the mind doesn't rush to interpret it, because there's nothing to interpret. It feels like a pause that wasn't chosen, a still point that arrives on its own. You might be sitting alone, or walking, or doing something ordinary, and suddenly, without warning, the constant internal commentary stops. Not forever. Just long enough for you to realize it can stop. This is the moment ancient contemplatives described as the veil thinning, not because something mystical enters, but because something artificial falls away. The identity that's been narrating your life steps back. And in its absence, there is awareness without commentary. You don't think, "This is awakening." You think nothing at all. And yet, everything feels unmistakably present. Esoteric Christian texts spoke of this as the inner Sabbath, a rest not of the body, but of the compulsive self, the part of you that's always evaluating, fixing, anticipating. When it rests, even briefly, what remains isn't emptiness. It's clarity without effort. Modern physics struggles to describe this state, but some theorists point to coherence, when a system no longer loses energy to internal friction. Nothing is fighting itself. Nothing is resisting observation. Everything simply is. This is why the experience feels neutral rather than euphoric. Truth, when fully perceived, doesn't need to convince you. It stabilizes you. Most people expect the deepest revelation to feel overwhelming, but the deepest ones feel obvious, in a way that's almost disappointing to the part of us that wanted fireworks. In this stillness, there's no question of purpose, no searching for meaning, not because those things were answered, but because the need to ask disappears. And when the need disappears, you realize how much energy it was consuming. This is the sign that changes how you live afterward. Not dramatically, quietly. You stop explaining yourself as much. You stop chasing alignment and start noticing it. You stop fearing stillness and start trusting it. And here's the unsettling part. This sign doesn't repeat. Not because it's rare, but because once you recognize it, you don't look for it again. You recognize its echo instead, in decisions that feel clean, in moments where you don't hesitate, in choices that require no inner negotiation. This is why ancient teachers spoke in paradox. They weren't trying to confuse people. They were pointing to something that only reveals itself when the mind stops demanding proof. Now, pause with me here for a moment. If this content resonates with you, if it feels grounded, sincere, and different from what you usually encounter, I want to ask something quietly but honestly. Consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. This work isn't driven by profit or performance. It's created out of passion, curiosity, and respect for these deeper processes. Every subscription strengthens this community and allows this space to continue existing without distortion or pressure. Because what's being shared here isn't meant to entertain, it's meant to stabilize. And if you felt even a brief sense of stillness while listening, if something in you softened or settled or recognized itself, then you've already touched the edge of this sign. But here's what most people never hear. The stillness itself isn't the destination. It's the signal that the circuit has completed, and once a circuit completes, something changes permanently. Not in what you know, but in how you move. There's one final question that emerges after this realization. A question that doesn't ask for understanding, but for responsibility, and it's waiting quietly, just beyond this moment. Everything you've heard until now was never meant to give you something new to chase. It was meant to help you recognize what has already been happening inside you. The resistance you felt, the selective resonance that sharpened your attention, the stillness that arrived without explanation. These were never separate events. They were stages of the same awakening, one that doesn't pull you away from life, but brings you deeper into it. Most people think spiritual awakening means escaping the world, becoming detached, rising above. But the truth is far more grounded. Real awakening doesn't remove you from your life. It returns you to it, clearer, steadier, more honest than before. You don't wake up to abandon your responsibilities. You wake up to carry them differently. You stop living on autopilot. You stop outsourcing your sense of direction. You stop waiting for permission to trust what you already know. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your choices begin to reflect something deeper than fear or habit. This is how consciousness actually expands, not through dramatic moments, but through quiet alignment. And that's why these signs appear the way they do. They don't overwhelm you, they prepare you. They strip away what no longer fits, so that what remains can move forward without friction. They teach you discernment instead of dependency, presence instead of performance, integration instead of endless seeking. You were never meant to collect answers forever. At some point, the answers turn inward and ask something of you instead. And that question, the one that arises after the stillness, is simple but demanding. How will you live differently now that you can no longer pretend you don't see? There's no pressure in that question, no moral weight, just clarity. Because awareness doesn't force change, it invites responsibility. And responsibility, when chosen freely, becomes purpose. This is where many people hesitate. Not because they don't understand, but because understanding removes excuses. Once something clicks, you can't unknow it. You can ignore it, but you'll feel the cost. And most people don't fail at this stage because they aren't capable. They fail because they underestimate the power of small, consistent embodiment. You don't need to overhaul your life overnight. You don't need to announce anything. You don't need to prove your awakening to anyone. You only need to act in alignment when the moment quietly asks you to. That might look like speaking honestly when it would be easier to stay silent, choosing rest when your old patterns would push for more, letting go of what drains you, even if it once defined you. These are not grand gestures. They are precise ones. And precision is the language of real transformation. If you're listening to this and something feels settled inside you, not excited, not anxious, just steady, then this message did what it came to do. It didn't give you direction. It reminded you that you already have one. Now, before we close this space, I want to invite you into something simple and human. If this video resonated with you, leave a comment with your name and the city you're watching from. Not as a formality, but as a quiet declaration of presence. I read these comments, and in the next video, I'll be sharing and acknowledging some of them, because recognition turns insight into connection. And if you felt supported, grounded, or clarified by what you experienced here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This community exists because people choose depth over noise, sincerity over spectacle. Every subscription strengthens this space and allows it to remain focused on meaning rather than metrics. You don't need to rush forward after this. You don't need to search for what comes next. Just notice how you move differently from here. Because when the signs stop repeating, it's not because the guidance ended. It's because you've become capable of carrying it yourself. And once that happens, life no longer needs to call you loudly. It trusts you to listen.